This is Latter-day Presentations, where we discuss topics and issues of faith for Latter-day Saints. Welcome to today's presentation. Today we're going to talk about prophet and vaccine. We're going to explore a controversy that exists among Latter-day Saints in our day. Let's get started. And let's begin by asking some questions. During the COVID pandemic, Latter-day Saints who carry a skepticism toward the U.S. government and the Western medical establishment found themselves conflicted over prophetic counsel to wear masks and get vaccinated. And here I need to let you viewers know that this presentation is more oriented toward Latter-day Saints in the United States, because this controversy seems to be most prevalent in the United States. And with that in mind, the questions that we might ask are, did church leaders make accurate assessments of risk? Was guidance from church leaders inspired? And did church members have valid spiritual grounds for disagreement with church leadership? These are questions that I have seen some Latter-day Saints put forward on social media and in other places. And as we explore them, we need to start by talking about our own thinking, specifically partisan thinking. Now, partisan thinking is when we start with a problem, and when we become aware of that problem, the first thing that we do is we ask, what team am I on? And in the United States, people gravitate toward two ideological and political teams. If I'm on Team Progressive, then as I think about this problem, I'm going to say, what are my team's talking points with this problem? And what views should I avoid and deny? And likewise, if I'm on Team Conservative, I'm going to say, what are my team's talking points and what views should I avoid and deny? Again, I need to reiterate, this is especially common here in the United States. And this should not have been what happened with the COVID-19 pandemic. But here in the US, it seems like every issue, no matter how apolitical it is, becomes politicized. And people gravitate toward their partisan camps as they look for ways of thinking and responding. And now I want to quote from Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. I quote from it fairly often because it's such a valuable book. And here in this passage, Jonathan Haidt talks about a social science experiment that took place, where a researcher showed people negative messaging about their political candidate. But at the end of that sequence, he showed them a positive message that validated their positive views of their political candidate. And when he did that, something took place in their brains. Let's read about this. Once Weston released them from the threat, and here he's talking about the threat of having their political candidate disparaged, the ventral striatum started humming. That's a part of the brain. That's one of the brain's major reward centers. All animal brains are designed to create flashes of pleasure when the animal does something important for its survival, and small pulses of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the ventral striatum and a few other places are where these good feelings are manufactured. Heroin and cocaine are addictive because they artificially trigger this dopamine response. Rats who can press a button to deliver electrical stimulation to their reward centers will continue pressing until they collapse from starvation. Weston found that partisans escaping from handcuffs by thinking about the final slide, which restored their confidence in their candidate, got a little hit of dopamine. And if this is true, then it would explain why extreme partisans are so stubborn, closed-minded, and committed to beliefs that often seem bizarre or paranoid. Like rats that cannot stop pressing a button, partisans may be simply unable to stop believing weird things. The partisan brain has been reinforced so many times for performing mental contortions that free it from unwanted beliefs. Extreme partisanship may be literally addictive. This explains why so many people in the United States compulsively go to their favored news source just to hear their views validated. They're seeking that dopamine rush in the brain. But the problem is, as Latter-day Saints, we follow a prophet, and prophets don't exist to give us a partisan dopamine rush. When we think of politically active church leaders, sometimes we think about Ezra Taft Benson. He held very prominent political roles, even while he served as a church leader. But when he became president of the church, his political messaging stopped. Now, people who were expecting President Benson to continue his political messaging after he became president of the church were probably shocked by the statement he made at his opening press conference. There he said, "My heart has been filled with an overwhelming love and compassion for all members of the church and our Heavenly Father's children everywhere. I love all our Father's children of every color, creed, and political persuasion. My only desire is to serve as the Lord would have me do." That is a remarkable statement. One of my personal favorite statements ever made by a president of the church. And let's look at some of the things that Ezra Taft Benson taught us about following prophets. He said, "Learn to keep your eye on the prophet. He is the Lord's mouthpiece and the only man who can speak for the Lord today. Let his inspired counsel take precedence. Let his inspired words be a basis for evaluating the counsel of all lesser authorities." And here I would add our political and other sources of information. "Then live close to the Spirit, so you may know the truth of all things." He also said, "As a prophet reveals the truth, it divides the people. The honest in heart heed his words, but the unrighteous either ignore the prophet or fight him. When the prophet points out the sins of the worldly either want to close the mouth of the prophet or else act as if the prophet didn't exist, rather than repent of their sins. Popularity is never a test of truth." And I've highlighted this last sentence about popularity because popularity really is about just validating things that people already believe, giving them that dopamine rush in the brain. But prophets do not exist to feed our dopamine cravings. And if we go to prophets looking to have the same thing happen in our brain that happens when we feel validated by our political and other sources of information, we're going to be disappointed. Now, in the United States, it's really important to understand how we consume political information. Over the past couple of decades, our sources of news have become very politicized, and they have consolidated into two basic ideological camps. On the political left, we have MSNBC and its partners, including Vox. I love the title of this article, "The Vox Formula, Telling Privileged People What They Already Believe." Vox is a source of left-leaning messaging, and it has done well by affirming things that people already believe, giving them that constant rush of dopamine. On the right, we have Fox News, and Fox News has been very successful by appealing largely to senior citizens in America and telling them flattering messages about how if people like them were in charge, the world would be a better place. So these two ideological camps serve to accommodate our cravings for partisan thinking. And the problem becomes when we assume that the church is or should be aligned with one or another of these ideological camps. Remember how Ezra Taft Benson said that we should treat the prophet's counsel above other authorities. That is part of what it means to give heed and sustain the prophet. And that involves diminishing the influence of our other sources of information in favor of Christ and his ordained servants. And if we fail to do that, then we end up in conflict with Christ and his ordained servants. Here's a case study. In December of 2020, President Dallin H. Oaks posted this picture on social media, where he showed he and his wife Kristen having Thanksgiving dinner together with a picture of their family. And President Oaks said what prompted this was the need to remember the cautions we have been given to reduce the exposure to COVID-19. The Oaks family takes those cautions very seriously. So how did Latter-day Saints respond to this? Well, Latter-day Saints who had been consuming messaging contrary to what church leaders were teaching about COVID responded with angry comments. And the sad thing is, many of these Latter-day Saints are people who would consider themselves to be believing and sustaining members of the church. And now let's talk about the COVID vaccine. And before we go further, I should acknowledge that I am fully vaccinated. I got the COVID vaccine when it came out, and I've gotten every booster that has been made available to me since then. I was eager to get the COVID vaccine when it came out, but many members of the church had a much harder time with the decision over whether or not to get the vaccine. And here I want to recommend reading an article written by Jacob Hess in Public Square magazine. Jacob is a good friend of mine, and I think he did an amazing service to the church with this article. He offered up examples, specific stories of Latter-day Saints who struggled over this decision. And I think this was a very useful article in increasing our understanding of the thought processes of people who were reluctant or hesitant or fearful or doubtful in response to counsel to get vaccinated. For many church members, this was a very, very severe test. And there's another test that we faced during the COVID pandemic. And I wrote an article about that. And it's about how we treat each other. Because different people in the church responded in different ways to counsel during the COVID pandemic. Some people were willing and eager to make changes, and other people had a much harder time with it. That caused a lot of conflict among a lot of church members toward each other and toward their leaders. So in my article, I explored ways that we can try to be understanding and be peacemakers in those situations. And now let's talk specifically about questions surrounding COVID-19, questions that church members have felt confused about. Here I want to talk about specific claims and the validity or lack of validity to those claims, and then whether they are actually relevant to our initial questions of whether church leaders were inspired to give us the counsel that they gave us. So let's begin with a claim that COVID was nothing more than a bad cold or flu, and the government took advantage of it to enact a progressive agenda. Is this claim accurate? I would say it's partially true. First, let's talk about parts of the claim that are false. COVID was way more severe than ordinary cold and flu viruses. Yet it is true that the government took advantage of it to enact a progressive agenda. There's no question that COVID was very dangerous. We saw its effects ruining and even taking lives all throughout the United States and the rest of the world. So to dismiss it as nothing is to deny some very important realities. And yes, it is true that many people in the government and other institutions, such as the World Economic Forum, saw COVID as an opportunity to implement wide-sweeping progressive political objectives. But is that relevant to our questions around the inspiration of church leaders? Well, there is some relevance. Church leaders maintained that the pandemic was real and needed to be taken seriously. So they were absolutely correct on that point. But the political agendas of other institutions are not relevant to keeping church members safe from COVID. Those questions around external political agendas are separate, and they need to be evaluated on their own. Let's examine another claim. And the claim is that the COVID virus was the product of government-funded research. In terms of accuracy, I would say that this is probably true. There are very good reasons to believe that the COVID virus did not emerge from natural processes. That is what I tend to think, and I know that some people disagree. But what is the relevance of that to what we're discussing, the inspiration of church leaders? The relevance is zero. The origins of the virus may have relevance for research into vaccines and treatments, but those questions have no value as organizations decide how to keep people safe. Let's talk about another claim. And this claim is that the COVID vaccines were and are not safe. What is the accuracy of this claim? I would say it's mostly untrue. The vaccines have caused harm to some people, but they have been enormously effective in reducing overall hospitalizations and deaths, with rare side effects. Here's an article on NBC, and it's one of many that have been discussing some of the side effects of COVID vaccines. Vaccine injury is a real thing, and people are definitely justified in being concerned about it. But as we talk about the risks, we also need to frankly acknowledge that most medical procedures involve some risk. When we talk about something being medically safe, we are not talking about zero risk of any side effects or zero risk of adverse reactions. It's more of a question of whether a medical intervention is more likely to benefit us than harm us. That is what determines whether something is safe. Now, does this have relevance to our discussion of inspiration? I think it has high relevance because church leaders were emphatic in their messaging that the vaccines were safe. And we need to be clear about the calculation that medical professionals employed when evaluating the safety of COVID vaccines. What is the likelihood for you and other people of experiencing severe side effects from a COVID vaccine versus the likelihood of experiencing severe problems from COVID without vaccination? And because so many people's bodies responded so differently to the COVID virus, this is actually a pretty difficult question to answer in a definitive way. So let's explore another claim, and this claim is that the COVID vaccines were or are not effective. How about the accuracy of this claim? I think it's mostly untrue. When it comes to preventing infection and illness, COVID vaccine effectiveness has waned over time, but they have been enormously effective in reducing overall hospitalizations and deaths with rare side effects. On this question, the data are crystal clear. You can see a clear drop in deaths from COVID after the vaccine went forward. Here's a diagram that was put forward by Intermountain Healthcare, and it's similar to ones that other medical institutions put forward, showing on that particular day the differences in hospitalization and treatment between unvaccinated and vaccinated COVID patients. And here's a study that just simply modeled out what we would have seen if trends had continued without vaccination. Now, when it comes to a study like this, I'm a little more reluctant to place full confidence in people's ability to predict the future, even when they have sophisticated computer modeling at their disposal. But there's no question from the chart that we saw earlier that the vaccine absolutely stopped a very dangerous trend. And finally, here's a study on the waning effectiveness of COVID vaccines. Some people have looked at the waning effectiveness, how vaccine effectiveness has diminished over time, and they have concluded that vaccines were never effective in the first place. That's a logical fallacy that we call a non sequitur. It's just the product of lack of critical thinking skills. The vaccines have been very, very effective at preventing severe illness, hospitalizations, and death. Now, is this question relevant to our discussion of inspiration of church leaders? I would say it is highly relevant because church leaders were emphatic in their messaging that the vaccines were effective. Let's talk about another claim, and this claim is that COVID recommendations were the product of sound science. What of the accuracy of that claim? It's partially true. Masking, distancing, and sanitizing of surfaces are well-established, scientifically verified means for stopping the spread of microbes. But some COVID recommendations were, in fact, the product of political ideology. Here's a study from Harvard University that discusses that. And it's a frank acknowledgement of a real problem in our medical institutions. How about the relevance of this to our discussion, though? I would say there's some relevance. Church leadership made recommendations that were in line with very well-established science. But whether or not governments and other organizations politicized their recommendations is not the church's concern. Again, the church's concern is with keeping people safe. And those other questions are external and need to be evaluated in different ways by other people. Let's talk about another claim. And this claim is that COVID vaccines were developed by pharmaceutical companies that have a corrupting influence on the government and other institutions. How about the accuracy of this claim? I would say it's absolutely true. There is no question that pharmaceutical companies steer research outcomes and do other things that compromise the validity of medical scientific research. But is this relevant to our questions? I would say not at all. It has zero relevance. The corrupting influence of pharmaceutical companies is definitely cause for alarm, but that issue has no bearing on whether they are capable of producing effective vaccines, which was the only relevant question in 2020. Now, if this specific question bothers you, I would refer you to a recent presentation I did on why I don't panic about controversies surrounding the church. One of the things that causes a lot of difficulty for church members is when the church in any way collaborates with or even seems to offer any kind of support to institutions outside of the church that we don't trust. Here's what I said there. He said, "I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness." And in another passage, he said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." What Jesus is saying is that his followers need to get comfortable with the fact that they are going to interact with the world and the world's systems. In our day, that means the church is going to have interactions with lawyers, accountants, governments, medical systems, academia, and the United Nations. These are all groups and institutions that a lot of people view with a lot of very justified suspicion. There are very good reasons to call many of these groups and institutions the mammon of unrighteousness. As church members, we would do well to understand that sometimes there may be good reasons for the church to work with systems and institutions that we normally distrust. I explore this in a little more depth in that video, and I'll put a link to that video in the show description here. And now let's discuss clarity about prophets, because a lot of church members struggle to reconcile their notions of how prophets should operate with how President Nelson and the governing councils of the church operated during the COVID pandemic. So let's start with a claim, and the claim is that the obedience to prophetic counsel should never result in harm. Is that claim accurate? I would say it's false. Prophetic counsel is only sometimes about physical safety. Think, for example, of Zion's Camp, or the Mormon Battalion, or think of the example of Jesus prophesying the death of Peter, who had given everything to follow the Savior. Sometimes prophetic guidance does lead people to physical safety, but often it really does not. We should never mistake prophetic guidance as a guarantee of zero physical harm in whatever we undertake to do. Let's examine another claim, and this claim is that obedience to prophetic counsel is mindless conformity. And the accuracy of this claim, it's absolutely false. Obedience is better conceptualized as a spiritual muscle. And likewise, rejection of counsel is the exercise of a different muscle. Exercising one or the other muscle makes it easier to use that muscle in the future. And this last point should serve as a warning, because our spiritual muscles are just like our physical muscles. Neglect or misuse of a muscle makes it harder to use in the future. And that leads us to a related question. Is it okay to disagree with the prophet, as so many church members did when it came to counsel around COVID? And the answer is yes, but take inventory. If you disagree with the prophet, doesn't make you a bad person. It just means you have work to do. You need to ask yourself some questions. Has my receptivity to prophetic counsel been poisoned by other voices? Am I evaluating the prophet through a non-gospel lens, like politics or academia? Or I would add partisan messaging? Have I first made the effort to understand the best possible case for the prophet's counsel? Would I feel comfortable if my loved ones were to take the logic of my disagreement and apply it to other areas of the gospel? I read a blog post from a conservative Latter-day Saint blogger who rejected the counsel of the first presidency when it came to COVID. And there was a commenter on that post who said she would never take that blogger seriously when it came time for him to talk about the family proclamation, because she could see right through his selective obedience and the motivated reasoning that led him to reject prophetic counsel around COVID. When I talk about sustaining church leaders and how I respond to policies and guidelines and directives that come from church leadership, I think about my kids. When they observe what I say and do, what lessons do they take away in terms of what it means to sustain? Consider these remarks from Elder Jeffrey R. Holland.
In this church, there is an enormous amount of room and scriptural commandment for studying and learning, for comparing and considering, for discussion and awaiting further revelation. We all learn line upon line, precept upon precept, with the goal being authentic religious faith informing genuine Christ-like living. In this, there is no place for coercion or manipulation, no place for intimidation or hypocrisy. But no child in this church should be left with uncertainty about his or her parents' devotion to the Lord Jesus Christ, the restoration of his church, and the reality of living prophets and apostles who now, as in earlier days, lead that church according to the will of the Lord, the mind of the Lord, the word of the Lord, and the power of God unto salvation. In such basic matters of faith, prophets do not apologize for requesting unity, indeed conformity, in the eloquent sense that the prophet Joseph Smith used that latter word. In any case, as Elder Neil Maxwell once said to me in a hallway conversation, there didn't seem to be any problem with conformity the day the Red Sea opened. Parents simply cannot flirt with skepticism or cynicism, then be surprised when their children expand that flirtation into full-blown romance. If in matters of faith and belief, children are at risk of being swept downstream by this intellectual current or that cultural rapid, we as their parents must be more certain than ever to hold to anchored, unmistakable moorings, clearly recognizable to those of our own household. It won't help anyone if we go over the edge with them, explaining through the roar of the falls all the way down that we really did know the church was true and that the keys of the priesthood really were lodged there, but we just didn't want to stifle anyone's freedom to think otherwise. No, we can hardly expect the children to get to shore safely if the parents don't seem to know where to anchor their own boat. Isaiah once used a variation on such imagery when he said of unbelievers, their tacklings are loosed. They could not strengthen their mast. They could not spread the sail. I think some parents may not understand that even when they feel secure in their own minds regarding matters of personal testimony, they can nevertheless make that faith too difficult for their children to detect. We can be reasonably active, meeting-going Latter-day Saints, but if we do not live lives of gospel integrity and convey to our children heartfelt, powerful convictions regarding the truthfulness of the restoration and the divine guidance of the church from the first vision to this very hour, then those children may, to our regret but not our surprise, turn out not to be visibly active, meeting-going Latter-day Saints, or sometimes anything close to it. Not long ago, Sister Holland and I met a fine young man who came in contact with us after he had been roaming around through the occult and sorting through a variety of Eastern religions, all in an attempt to find religious faith. His father, he admitted, believed in nothing whatsoever. But his grandfather, he said, was actually a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But he didn't do much with it, the young man said. He was always pretty cynical about the church. From a grandfather who is cynical, to a son who is agnostic, to a grandson who is now looking desperately for what God had already once given his family. What a classic example of the warning Elder Richard L. Evans once gave. Said he, sometimes some parents mistakenly feel that they can relax a little as to conduct and conformity, or take perhaps a so-called liberal view of basic and fundamental things, thinking that a little laxness or indulgence won't matter, or they may fail to teach or attend church, or may voice critical views. Some parents seem to feel that they can ease up a little on the fundamentals without affecting their family or their family's future. But, he observed, if a parent goes a little off course, the children are likely to exceed the parent's example.
Echoing what Elder Holland said, if people look at me and how I sustain, what do they learn about what it means to sustain? And would I feel comfortable with them applying those lessons to other areas of the gospel? And finally, what if every member of the church were to adopt my definition of sustaining? What kind of a church would we have? Would everybody just go their own way and disregard any counsel that made them uncomfortable or that conflicted with their political influencers? Or would we be able to unify and be of one heart and mind? These are difficult and challenging questions. Once again, I'm going to repeat, if you disagree with the prophet, that doesn't make you a bad person. It just means you have work to do. And make no mistake, that soul-searching work is very difficult. On that note, I want to recommend a post that I did at Nauvoo Neighbor, and it's about questions of internal and external authority. It's a hard-hitting post where I'm asking the reader to take a good, hard look at the validity of disagreements with the prophet. That kind of introspective work is what I believe it means to sustain our church leaders. And now I want to return to President Benson and a couple of things that he said. He said each president of the church has been uniquely selected for the time and situation which the world and church needed. All were men of the hour, as we have witnessed in President Spencer W. Kimball. Contemplate the miracle of that foreordination and preparation. Though called and given keys many years prior to the time that the mantle fell upon him, the president was always the right man in the right place for the times. This miracle alone is one of the marks of the divinity of the church. If we want to know how well we stand with the Lord, then let us ask ourselves how well we stand with his mortal captain. How close do our lives harmonize with the Lord's anointed, the living prophet, president of the church, and with the quorum of the first presidency? I recently did a video making the case that President Russell M. Nelson is legitimately a prophet of God. I'm inclined to believe that he was receiving revelation around COVID, because I believe witness testimony to that effect. Here is something that I said, quoting his wife, Sister Wendy Nelson. Sister Wendy Nelson, in an interview, was talking about something that she noticed happen around the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. She said, so let's just refine that to say, since this last year was no travel, we're really talking about 35 countries and 14 states in 2 years. That's what we're talking about. And let me just say one other thing about this year of no travel. Imagine this. Exactly a year ago, December 2019, I looked at our 2020 calendar to see where we would be going, where we would be traveling, and looked from January through July, every single month. There was a huge trip and huge arenas booked. And I thought, okay, well, this is what we'll do. And I knew that in between those, there was at least one huge trip a month that in between we would be doing local opportunities to be with our local congregations. There I am. I've sort of got my whole head set into this is how it's going to be in 2020. And suddenly, in early January, I looked on the calendar again and everything's gone, meaning all those trips were gone. So this is early January. This is pre-COVID. And I said, where did those trips go? And he said, I just felt like we didn't need to do them. I just felt like I should take those off the calendar. This is a wonderful example that speaks to the question of whether he's in tune with God's Spirit. There are situations where he just acts on inspiration without really knowing why. And this is a pretty remarkable example of that. Knowing that he was receiving that kind of revelation, it's not a leap of logic for me to conclude that he was receiving revelation in other areas of COVID policy for the church. And with that, let's have some closing thoughts. Returning to our original questions, did church leaders make accurate assessments of risk? The data around COVID and its impact on people show that demonstrably, yes, they made accurate assessments of risk. And was guidance from church leaders inspired? Also, I believe there are very good reasons to conclude yes. And then the final question, did church members have valid spiritual grounds for disagreement with church leadership? That's a harder question to answer because church leaders did recommend prayerful consideration and consultation with doctors and other medical authorities. I know some church members who went through that process and ended up not getting the COVID vaccine. It is not for me to judge people over these kinds of decisions, but I do think it is incumbent upon each of us to be very, very clear about the stakes involved in these decisions. And I'll close here with a quote from Elder Neal A. Maxwell. He said, "Make no mistake about it, brothers and sisters. In the months and years ahead, events are likely to require each member to decide whether or not he or she will follow the first presidency. Members will find it more difficult to halt longer between two opinions. President Marion G. Romney said many years ago that he had never hesitated to follow the counsel of the authorities of the church, even though it crossed my social, professional, or political life. This is a hard doctrine, but it is a particularly vital doctrine in a society which is becoming more wicked. In short, brothers and sisters, not being ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ includes not being ashamed of the prophets of Jesus Christ." I could not agree more with this statement. Thank you for joining me. This has been an episode of Latter-day Presentations. We would like to remind viewers that our channel represents our own views and not necessarily any official positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We hope this presentation has been informative. Our notes for this show are at Nauvoo Neighbor, and the link can be found in the show description. Also in the show description, we have a link to provide feedback. If you would like to suggest a topic for discussion, or if you would like to contribute a presentation on a topic of interest to you, let us know. Thanks again for joining us.